Okay, I'm just going to say it up front. Today's reading from 2 Corinthians is just weird. I don't say this to denigrate Paul or this letter, only that it talks of things about which we have no knowledge or personal experience. Third heaven? What is that? But one thing is clear, no matter how obscure are the things Paul refers to, the center of this passage remains one of the most powerful affirmations of God's grace in the midst of human troubles. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Thursday, June 15th, 2023. Paul is continuing his defense of his apostolic authority and the validity of his preaching as over against the message of those he derisively calls super-apostles. Let's get straight to today's reading from 2 Corinthians. Paul says, "It is necessary to boast. Nothing is to be gained by it, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body I do not know, God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. On behalf of such a person I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. But if I wish to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me, even considering the exceptional character of the revelations." Let me pause here to process what we've read so far. There is so much here that is simply impossible to nail down. In the first place, why does Paul even talk about things that, as he says, are not to be told? The only thing we can surmise is that his rivals, those super-apostles, might typically have bragged about dramatic spiritual experiences, perhaps like the prophet Isaiah's vision of the heavenly court with the cherubim and seraphim. If that's the case, Paul is clearly trying to tell the Corinthians what he can about his own spiritual experience. But why frame it as someone else's experience? He says, I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. If Paul is really talking about someone else, it simply makes no sense in this context. But interpreters have long assumed that Paul really is referring to himself, but speaking in the third person to avoid the appearance of bragging about his particular experience. And what of this third heaven? This is actually a little easier to nail down. The ancient world generally, including parts of Judaism, pictured heaven as a series of levels. You've heard the phrase seventh heaven? Some traditions spoke of seven levels of heaven, where the seventh heaven was understood as the highest of all. Other traditions, apparently including the one which Paul understood, spoke of just 3 levels of heaven, where the third level was the place where the souls of the righteous dwelt after death. For us, this is all pretty obscure and not really all that critical, though it raises questions. But it does help us to know that the ancients thought about heaven this way. Now, let's continue with the passage. Paul's rhetoric literally turns from heaven to earth. Therefore, he says, to keep me from being too elated, that is, elated about being in the third heaven, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. You see, this is where we get the term a thorn in the flesh, and our contemporary use of the term is actually pretty helpful in understanding Paul's meaning here. When we use the term, it can mean almost anything that afflicts us, from a physical impediment to a challenging situation, to a person who is just particularly annoying. We don't really have any idea which sense Paul refers to here. A physical impediment? A person sent to aggravate him? Paul simply doesn't say, and in spite of centuries of speculation, no one has ever made a convincing case about the exact nature of his thorn in the flesh. But no matter. It's not important that we know what it was, except that it piques our curiosity. What is important is how Paul interprets it. He interprets it, interestingly, as a gift of God, to keep him humble and to remind him that he is not omnipotent. It prompts him to say the words that really define Paul's ministry. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Paul's point here, and it applies to virtually every biblical figure, is that God has a way of choosing not the greatest, the biggest, the smartest, the best looking, but the weakest and most ordinary to fulfill God's own purposes. And why? So that we never ever forget that it is God at work. It reminds us never to give glory to those who serve, but only to God. I say it frequently, that one of the reasons I believe the Bible is that it presents us human beings unflinchingly with all our failings. It doesn't seek to make superheroes out of us, and that is the real point of this rather weird and obscure passage. Good news for us too, isn't it? We don't have to be perfect or even pretend to be perfect to be acceptable and useful to God. God chooses us and uses us just as we are. Tomorrow, were the Corinthians using hospitality as a weapon? But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.